Parshat Vayikra that we will read this week is a parsha that talks about karbanos, offerings. Many of the halachos contained within this section of the Torah are very complex. Many of them seem not so relevant to us because we don't have a Beis Hamikdash, we don't have a temple, we don't have karbanos, we don't have offerings. One of the intricate laws that sometimes gets overlooked, misunderstood, is the concept of carbon ola v'yored. This is the idea that there are certain averos, for example, a person who has the ability to give testimony and doesn't give testimony, intentionally or unintentionally. So such an individual ultimately has to bring a carbon, an offering for their sin. However, the kind of carbon obligated is called a carbon ola v'yored. Ola v'yored literally means goes up and comes down. It's a carbon that, depending on a person's wealth, that will determine what kind of an offering a person has to bring. A wealthier person has to bring a sheep or a goat. A poorer person can bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young doves. The great 13th century Spanish writer of the Sefer HaChinuch, we don't exactly know who authored this work, was in the school of Rabbi Halevi. Beautiful work on the 613 mitzvos, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. When he discusses this mitzvah Kuf Chav Gimel, so he points out that a poor person, if he wants to, is not allowed to bring the carbon of a wealthy person. If he decides, I did something wrong, and even though I don't really have the means, I'm going to stretch myself, I'm going to borrow money, and instead of bringing 2 turtle doves or 2 young doves, I'm going to go and I'm going to purchase a sheep or a goat. If he does so, he doesn't fulfill his obligation. Remarkable statement, especially in light of the fact that we find that there are other circumstances where, depending on a person's wealth, a person might give a different offering. So for example, someone who has tsaras, someone who has biblical leprosy. So the poor person is allowed to bring birds and doesn't have to bring animals as offerings. However, the Mishnah does teach us that if a poor person who is a recovered leper, a mitzora that has been healed, wants to bring an animal, wants to bring animals instead of birds, he's allowed to do so. So if it can happen in the case of mitzora, why not here? This is the question that I wonder about, and in fact, I'm not the first to ask this question. In fact, there was a great group of Polish scholars who got together shortly before the Second World War, and they were discussing this idea. Amongst them were Rabbi Mordechai Alter, who was the Admor, the Chassidish Rebbe of Gur, known as the Imre Emes. There was the Sokolova Rebbe, was there as well, which is called Morgenstern. There were 2 other great scholars who were there, Rabbi Nosson Spiegelglass and Rabbi Menachem Zemba, Hakelim Kom Damam, that Hashem should avenge their blood. They were murdered in the Holocaust. And they were discussing this idea. And Rabbi Menachem Zemba, who was a great, great scholar, had a whole long pilpul to explain why, when it comes to a carbon ola v'yored, a poor person can't bring the offering of a rich person. And after the whole lengthy discussion and everyone was going back and forth, the Imre Emes, the Ger Rebbe, who had said nothing the entire time, got up, and as he was about to leave, he just muttered under his breath. He says, well, at the end of the day, he still owes a carbon. And after he walked away, the other scholars were dumbfounded by his comment. They didn't know what he meant. Until Rabbi Menachem Zemba explained, he said, now I understand. If you look carefully in the text, and you can look in the 5th chapter of Vayikra, our Kriyas Torah of this week, you'll see that it says that in the case of a carbon ola v'yored, the wealthy person brings a goat or a sheep. However, the poor person has to bring 2 birds. One is considered to be a sin offering, a carbon chatas. just like the wealthy person, and one has to bring a carbon ola, a burnt offering. So what the Imre Emes was trying to say was that in the case of a Mitzorah, in the case of a leper, so yeah, it's just a question of you're bringing the same offerings, and what are you bringing, animals or birds? So if a poor person wants to bring animals instead of bringing birds, he can do so. But here, if a poor person has the obligation to bring a carbon chatas and a carbon ola, a sin offering and a burnt offering, even if he brings the burnt offering of a rich man, he doesn't really fully discharge his obligation, because he also has to bring the burnt offering, the carbon ola. So this story, certainly on a prima facie, on a basic level, displays the great humility of the Imre Emes, the Ger Rebbe, that he could have spoken up earlier, but he didn't want to, and he just made one brief comment and he explained this whole situation. But in my mind, this story emphasizes something that we need to think about in our very challenging time. You can have two people, same situation, same challenge, and yet they have very, very different obligations. The poor person, why is it that he has to bring not only a carbon chatas, but also a carbon ola? Bottom line is you have two people who committed the same wrong sin. In the example that I gave before, they didn't testify, even though they could have. So why is their obligation different? The answer is that their circumstances are different. And when circumstances are different, different responses are necessary. We are, as a community, as a people, and as a world, we are like that poor person. We can't just simply bring a sin offering. We don't have prophets amongst us. We don't know why this terrible tragedy has befallen our world. But we ought to work on self-improvement. Every single one of us, every man, woman, and child should ask, what can I do better? How can I be a greater person? Maybe there's some failing in my conduct. It's true. Everybody should look inward. But it is also true that in a time like this, that we should not wallow in depression. We should not simply look down upon ourselves. We must also elevate ourselves, even if we feel impoverished, even if we cannot just come in contact with one another. Even if I'm standing here talking to an empty shul instead of talking to all of you. Even if I can't shake hands and say good Shabbos, even if we can't talk to each other from a distance of closer than 9 feet. Even in such a time, we have to lift ourselves up. We also have to think of, what can I do for myself, for Hashem, for others, to be a greater and better person. There are certainly chesed opportunities in our own community, such as volunteering to assist those who are less fortunate. There are so many things that one can do. Spoke a little bit in the past about spending some time reaching out to those who are shuttered in, and I would encourage you, try to think about people who you don't normally reach out to. Reach out to them. Reach upward. And hopefully one day we will all gather together closely to bring karbanos in a rebuilt Beis Hamikdash. May it be b'meher v'yameinu. Amen.